It was February 19, 1982, in a quiet residential community in the town of Woonsocket, Rhode Island. On that day, it was stunned by the most savage murder in its history. At approximately 3:30 p.m., Doug Heath returned from work to his apartment at 409 Providence Street, where he lived with his wife and stepdaughter. As he walked through the back door, he found his 27-year-old neighbor Susan Lafert's 3-year-old daughter, Nicole, locked out of their apartment. When he saw her standing on the stairs, he knew immediately something was wrong. He asked her where Susan was, and she told him that she was downstairs, lying down. Doug tried to open the door into the Lafert's apartment, but it was locked. He knew something was wrong. He went down to the laundry room to check on Susan. He saw a woman's body basically sitting between the washer and the dryer. There was so much blood he could not tell who she was. He turned to his left and saw Susan lying face down in a puddle of blood. He realized that something really bad had happened to them. He immediately contacted the police. When rescue arrived at the scene along with the first officers, they found 2 women had been brutally assaulted in the basement. For all intents and purposes, they had been left for dead. The first one was pronounced dead at the scene, while Susan was in very critical condition. Paramedics stabilized her the best they could and transported her from the scene to the hospital emergency room. The 2 women both lived in the apartment building. 22-year-old Doreen Picard was pronounced dead at the scene. She had been beaten and strangled with her own sweater. Susan was barely alive. She was immediately rushed to the hospital. She was in surgery for 2.5 hours, during which a fiberglass plate was inserted into her skull. While she clung to life, her husband, Ernie, waited and prayed. He said the doctors described her as hanging by a thread. Her injuries were so severe that it was touch and go at the time. Miraculously, Susan survived, but she remained in a deep coma. Fearful for her safety, the police guarded her room around the clock. Detectives felt it was obvious that the perpetrator, in his mind, had left her and Doreen for dead. They became worried that the perpetrator would realize that there was a witness to the attack, and that he would come back and try to eliminate that witness by killing her. They were hopeful that when she came out of her coma, she would be able to tell them who was responsible. 30 days later, Susan finally came out of her coma, but she had no memory of her attack or her attacker. She developed total amnesia about what happened during the brutal assault in the basement. She had also sustained injuries that have left her physically disabled. She still occasionally loses her balance, has a broken left eardrum, and has only partial use of her right hand. Her amnesia sent the investigation of the seemingly motiveless crime back to square one. Susan said that everyone expected her to wake up and tell them who attacked her and killed Doreen. However, unfortunately, she does not know who attacked them. In the years since, her memory, or lack thereof, has remained the same regarding the attack. She does not know what he looked like or anything else about him. She has no memory whatsoever of the attack. Even now, her family is concerned for her safety. She requested that she not be identified on camera. Years later, police are still searching for a motive. Susan was a housewife with 2 young children and an active member of her neighborhood watch. Doreen was a high school homecoming queen from Bellingham, Massachusetts. At the time, she was studying for a career in childhood development. She lived upstairs with her boyfriend in the apartment building that the Laferts owned. Ironically, she was packing to move to a new building on the very day of the attack. Like Susan, her parents desperately want to find an answer as to who killed her. Her mother, Simone, says that they go to bed thinking about her and wake up thinking about her. She and the rest of the family plan to keep pushing and knocking on doors because she feels there is somebody out there that has the missing piece to the puzzle. Susan says that she has no recollection whatsoever of basically from New Year's Eve 1981 to February 19, 1982. The 19th is a complete blackout to her. On February 19, the day of the attack, she had lunch with her sister, Carol Rivet. At 1:30 p.m., 2 friends came to the door. When Susan came back from it, she stuck her head in the parlor and said, "Carol, I'm going downstairs. I'll be right back." When she came back upstairs, Carol could hear her talking to somebody in the doorway. Carol got up to go see who she was talking to. She recognized one of the men, but did not recognize the other one. Susan introduced her to him. The men then went to the basement to look at some puppies that Susan was selling. She talked to them for 5 minutes, and they left. 10 minutes later, at 1:45 p.m., Carol went home. That was the last time anyone saw Susan before the attack. No one can be sure what happened that day between 1:45 p.m. and 3:20 p.m., when Doug discovered Susan and Doreen's bodies. it is believed that both, either together or separately, went down to do their laundry when they were attacked. Detective Sergeant Douglas Connell says that he was shocked by the initial scene. To him, the attack was unnecessarily brutal. It was not just a simple murder or assault, it was a frenzied attack and overkill. Only one person apart from Susan saw her attacker. Nicole was in the apartment that afternoon. Her grandmother, Florence Laferte, tried to coax the details of the attacker's identity out of Nicole's memory. According to her, Nicole said that she let him in. She thought he was Susan's friend. She said he was a bit bigger than Ernie. He had a mustache. He wore a cap with the visor toward the back, jeans, and sneakers. She said that when she heard Susan crying, she went downstairs, and as she was going down, he was coming up. He had a rag in his back pocket. It was red and white. She called it polka dots. She was then locked in the hallway while he escaped through the front. He left his murder weapon, a 28-inch metal pipe, in the house as he left. It was not found for 4 days. After the assault, Nicole was questioned extensively by the police department. Connell says that as much as they would like to have a person who definitely saw the perpetrator that day, her story has changed too much to be of real value to the police. The stress and confusion that she was under at that point in time made it very difficult to get a solid, sure story from her. Connell says this case is complex because of the different factors involved. First, there are 2 victims. They bring their individual traits with them. They have their own friends and are involved in different things. Next, there were 2 newspaper ads that had been running. One was for puppies for sale, and the other was for an apartment for rent. Connell speculates that the perpetrator may have responded to one of the ads, was a friend of either Doreen and Susan, or their families, or was just a total stranger. Since the attack, Doreen's family has conducted their own informal investigation, which they believe has led to a series of anonymous phone calls. A few months after the crime, her father, Ron, received a phone call at about 2 a.m. The caller, a man, said that Ron should be concerned about his family and children, and not pursue the matter so hard. The caller also said that 4 openers, they might burn down his garage and repair shop. He says that every time they pursue the matter, they get more calls. He believes that they are making somebody uneasy. Simone says that it is like a nightmare. She says she is watching over her shoulder all of the time. She also fears that the attacker may come back for Susan, since she could possibly remember him. Susan says she still hopes every morning when she gets up, that maybe that day, something will snap and the memories will come back. However, she notes that she is no closer now than she was when the attack occurred. She says she is hurt. She does not look over her shoulder when she does things, but she always has a thought in the back of her mind, is he still there? The police are at a dead end in their investigation but feel that one new lead may solve this brutal murder. Suspects, Nicole said the attacker had a mustache, wore a cap, jeans, and sneakers, and was somewhat taller than Ernie. However, the description may not be accurate due to her young age at the time of the attack. This case originally aired on the May 18, 1988 special number 7 episode of Unsolved Mysteries. It was later reprofiled in the Dennis Farina-hosted series on the August 11, 2009 episode. It was also featured on the show, Guilty or Innocent? And the Trail Went Cold podcast. Fearing for her safety, Susan asked for her identity to be concealed during her interview. Some sources state that Susan was 25 at the time of the attack. Results, unresolved. Police received several tips as a result of the broadcast, which led them to new witnesses in the case. In 1990, 36-year-old Daniel Shaw, an unemployed Woonsocket construction worker and alcoholic, agreed to cooperate with police and implicated his friend, 37-year-old truck driver, Raymond Beaver Tempest Jr., in Doreen's murder and Susan's attack. He said that he and Tempest were at the crime scene and that Tempest had attacked the women. Tempest was a family friend of the Lafertes and had been considered a suspect from the beginning. However, police did not have enough evidence to charge him at the time. Susan was close friends with Tempest's wife and had been the maid of honor at their wedding. They were also reportedly having an affair at the time of the attack. Susan remembered having 2 affairs at the time, but could not remember who they were with. Shortly before it, the Lafertes arranged to mate their pit bull terrier with Tempest's pit bull. In return for using the latter, he was to receive the pick of the litter. These were the ones that the Lafertes were selling at the time. He, in turn, promised to give it to John Allard. Allard was living with Sherry Richards, Tempest's former sister-in-law. Allard and Tempest were the 2 men who visited Susan's apartment on the day of the attack. Afterward, Tempest returned alone to Sherry's apartment at around 2:30 p.m. He left to meet his brother-in-law, Bobby Montero, at a lounge. They returned at around 4:30 p.m. in Montero's huge, maroon, four-door car. Tempest had a bite or scratch mark on his wrist that had not been there earlier. He also had changed his boots. The next day, he, Allard, and Sherry talked about the attack and agreed to say that Tempest had been at Allard's father's house with Allard at the time of the attack. However, he claimed he only needed the alibi because he was using his brother's car to buy drugs. The car driven by Montero matched one seen by Lisa Ledoux, Doug's stepdaughter. She reported coming home at around 3:20 p.m. that afternoon. Shortly before him, while walking around the apartment building, she noticed an unfamiliar big maroon car parked in the driveway next to the cellar door. When she entered the apartment, she heard movement coming from the basement, possibly from the killer. By the time Doug returned home, the car was gone. In the years following the attack, Tempest reportedly confessed to the crime to several people. John Guarino, Tempest's neighbor, claimed that about a year later, he asked him if he was responsible. Tempest said that he had gone into the basement and hit one woman over the head, and when another one came down, he beat her up as well. While describing the attack, Tempest moved his right hand up and down, as if he were reenacting what he had done. Guarino did not take the confession seriously at first, as Tempest was kind of laughing as he talked. However, when Guarino arrived home, he told his then-girlfriend, Donna Bousquet, about Tempest's confession. A few weeks later, Tempest came to their apartment and appeared very nervous, saying the cops were outside, watching his house. He also threatened Guarino, saying that he'd better keep his mouth shut about their previous conversation or else he and Bousquet would be seriously injured. He again admitted responsibility for the murder, but added that they had no proof. Bousquet was also there when Tempest came to the apartment. She said he was very upset because Susan was going to tell his wife something and that they had just gotten back together. He also said that the other girl came down the stairs and saw him hitting Susan. He said that he could not let her get away, so he had to do her, too. He also said that his father had paid off a large sum of money to make sure that Tempest's name was never mentioned about this, and that the murder weapon had been wiped clean. Tempest also reportedly confessed to the murder on numerous occasions to Ronald Vaz. They occasionally snorted cocaine together. The first admission occurred 2 days after the attack. Tempest asked him if Danny Shaw told him everything about it, which he replied that Shaw had. Tempest then said that he was in serious trouble and that they'll get me for this one. My father won't get me out of this 1 inch. According to Vaz, on several occasions, Tempest visited him and gave him detailed accounts of the murder. On one occasion, he said that he had left the crime scene with Shaw and Montero in Montero's big maroon car. They returned to Tempest's house because he had blood on him. On another occasion, he told Vaz that he was afraid Montero would talk. According to him, Montero had already told someone about his involvement in the murder. He also said that his father had told him to get some strong alibis. On yet another occasion, Tempest told Vaz that on the day of the attack, he and Susan had had an argument in the basement over the puppy that he was supposed to receive. It then focused on their relationship. Apparently, she wanted them to leave their respective spouses, but he refused. She then hit him, and he responded by beating her. On another occasion, Tempest reportedly brought crime scene photos of the victims to Vaz's house. He passed them around and said, "They said I did a bad job. I don't think I did a bad job, do you?" Tempest also reportedly admitted to his involvement in the murder to a prostitute named Loretta Rivard. They had met at a bar in Massachusetts in January 1988. After drinking, snorting cocaine, and spending time together, they went back to his house. While there, he said to her, "Do you remember the girl that was killed in the basement in Woonsocket? I killed her. I'll get away with it. I'm a Tempest. I'll slide." Police suspected that Tempest used his connections to law enforcement to cover up evidence and prevent him from being charged. Before retiring, his father was the chief inspector for the Woonsocket Police Department. At the time of the attack, he was the high sheriff of Providence County. His brother Gordon was a police lieutenant at the time. He took Tempest's first statement. According to Vaz, Tempest told him that on the day of the attack, Tempest's father and Woonsocket Police Captain Francis Lynch went to the crime scene, instructed everyone out, and told Gordon to find the pipe and wipe it clean of fingerprints. After being unable to find it, they called Tempest and he told them of its location. Gordon found it, wiped it clean, and placed it in another location in the apartment. A few days later, He and other officers returned to the apartment. While walking through it, he pointed out the pipe. Terence Gelinas, who lived across the street from the apartment, said that when he arrived home that day, he noticed Tempest's father nearby. He also said that in 1991, he had a conversation with Tempest in which Tempest said, "Why, oh, you are going to wish you never got involved in this. You're going to get into a lot of trouble if you speak to the police." Tempest also said that he was going to kill one of the detectives involved in the investigation, and that his father was going to take care of other people involved in the case, including the prosecutor. He also said that if he got convicted, his father would take care of you, Gelinas. He also expressed regret for having had an affair with Susan. Two locksmiths who were installing deadbolts at the apartment the day after the attack said they saw two police officers there, one being Gordon. One locksmith said he saw one of the officers holding a pipe wrapped in a piece of cloth. After Shaw came forward, a statewide grand jury was convened. During the 16-month investigation, 80 witnesses were called. On June 4, 1991, the grand jury indicted Tempest for Doreen's murder. He was arrested the next day. By that point, the statute of limitations had run out on Susan's attack. Prosecutors claimed that, along with a cover-up, Tempest's family also helped to intimidate witnesses involved in the case. Assailants reportedly cut off Voss while he was driving on a country road in Belleville and beat him, warning him not to testify against Tempest. Assailants also fired several shotgun blasts at him in another incident. Police believe that Tempest and Susan got into an argument that turned violent when he began viciously beating her. They believe he killed Doreen because she walked in on the attack and tried to help her. They also believe Shaw and Montero acted as accomplices. However, in January 1992, Shaw recanted his testimony, claiming that it was coerced. He was dropped as a witness at Tempest's trial. Montero was called as a witness for the prosecution, but he repeatedly invoked his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination to questions from the state. Tempest and his attorneys claimed he was charged because of overzealous police work and that investigators were so eager to convict him that they coerced witnesses to alter their stories. They also noted that no physical evidence tied him to the scene. Prosecutors claimed that the witnesses were telling the truth and that none received deals or rewards for their testimony. On April 22, 1992, Tempest was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 85 years in prison. Shortly after Tempest's arrest, Gordon was arrested and charged with 2 counts of perjury for falsely testifying before the grand jury. He was later charged with 5 more counts following his testimony at Tempest's trial. Prosecutors claimed he falsely testified that he never interviewed a Woonsocket man who disputed Tempest's alibi. On July 6, 1993, he was convicted on all charges. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison and has since been released. Montero was also charged with perjury. He was accused of lying in his grand jury testimony about his whereabouts on the day of the attack. In June 1992, he was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Captain Lynch, who later became department chief, was suspended, but later cleared, of allegations that he meddled in the case. Captain Maurice Gillette was also accused of failing to pass along a 1984 tip from an informant who claimed that Tempest had killed Doreen. The charges against him were later dismissed. Since his arrest, Tempest has maintained his innocence in this case. He claimed that he never had an affair with Susan or argued with her that day. He also claimed that he was drinking beer and getting high with Montero and other friends when Doreen was killed. He said he did not come forward about this sooner because he did not want to embarrass his family. For unknown reasons, he did not even tell his lawyer about this until after the trial. In 2002, Tempest approached the New England Innocence Project for help. They agreed to take on this case. He and Gordon claimed that he was targeted by 2 police officials, SGT, Ronald Pennington and Police Chief Rodney Remblad, for political reasons. Specifically, Tempest claimed that Gordon was investigating Remblad for narcotics dealing, bribery, and auto theft. Gordon had also busted a chop shop and arrested Remblad's brother-in-law for possession of stolen vehicles. Gordon believed that Remblad was upset with him for this and decided to go after Tempest as a result. Tempest claimed that these officials coerced witnesses in this case, feeding them information about the crime and convincing them to implicate him. He claimed that the witnesses were vulnerable to police pressure because many were involved in drugs and/or prostitution. They also gave inconsistent and highly suspect testimony. He also claimed that the prosecutors were overzealous and withheld evidence favorable to his defense. Gordon claimed he uncovered evidence that pointed to the real killer a few weeks after the attack, but the lead was never seriously pursued by his superiors. He said he disclosed the suspect's identity to the 1991 grand jury, but was told that the suspect had an alibi. Tempest claimed that the real killer was a man named Donald DeGuess, who died in 2011. According to one source, at a get-together after Doreen's funeral, Nicole saw him and said, "I think that's the man who boomed Mama." She had also interacted with Tempest, but never reacted negatively with him. DeGuess also reportedly made incriminating statements to People. He had an alibi for the day of the attack, but there were apparent inconsistencies with it. When asked in the hospital to identify her assailant, Susan wrote the letters DA and either a Y or a G. When asked if DeGuess was her attacker, she nodded. However, after she recovered, she said she did not remember being questioned or naming DeGuess as her attacker. Furthermore, another name she nodded in the affirmative to was Donald Duck. Tempest's lawyers located a deed, which cast doubt on some of Vaz's testimony. He claimed that several conversations between him and Tempest occurred shortly after the attack on a farm he owned. However, the deed showed that he did not purchase the farm until several months later. Tempest's lawyers were also able to get DNA testing done on hairs found in Doreen's hand. The testing determined that 2 of the hairs did not belong to him. A third one could not be excluded as his. However, investigators noted that the hairs could have come from the basement floor. Supporting this theory is the fact that the hairs came from at least 2 different people. Also, no roots were attached to the hairs, meaning that she most likely did not pull them from an attacker. In 2014, Tempest and his attorneys asked for his conviction to be vacated based on his allegations of police and prosecutorial misconduct. The request was denied. However, in 2015, the request was made again. In July, after reviewing the case, State Superior Court Judge Daniel Procaccini decided to vacate Tempest's conviction. He concluded that police and prosecutors had violated Tempest's right to a fair trial by coaching witnesses, using improper police procedures, failing to disclose favorable evidence, and suppressing key details about a witness's changing statements. Judge Procaccini found that prosecutors did not disclose statements from the owners of the maroon car that was reportedly seen at the crime scene. They said that, although they sometimes lent the car to Montero, they did not let him borrow it on the day of the attack. Judge Procaccini noted that one witness, Lisa, originally did not mention seeing an unfamiliar car outside of the apartment. However, after a conversation with an investigator years later, she remembered seeing the car. He ruled that the initial investigation was mismanaged. The crime scene was never properly secured, and the only person available to gather evidence was unfamiliar with standard procedures. However, he also noted that the newly discovered evidence did not prove Tempest's innocence. Tempest was released on bail and remained in home confinement while the state debated on whether or not to retry him for Doreen's murder. In 2016, the Rhode Island Supreme Court upheld Judge Procaccini's ruling. In March 2017, the state announced that they planned to retry Tempest. Despite the fact that 9 witnesses had died since the first trial, they maintained that his accusations of prosecutorial misconduct were pure speculation and conjecture that would be best addressed through cross-examination at a new trial. However, on December 18, 2017, Tempest entered an Alford plea on the murder charge, which meant that although he maintained his innocence, he accepted that there was enough evidence to convict him. As a result of the plea, he was sentenced to time served and released from police custody after serving 24 years in prison. With Tempest's plea, police consider this case closed. However, there is still debate over who was really responsible. Since his plea, he has claimed that he felt forced to enter it because the judge's pretrial rulings favored the prosecutors. He feared spending more time in prison. In December 2020, Tempest filed a lawsuit against Pennington, Remblatt, and the town of Woonsocket for their alleged roles in his conviction. He argued that he was improperly arrested, unfairly tried, wrongfully convicted, and imprisoned due to the unlawful and improper actions of Remblatt and Pennington. In April 2021, the town of Woonsocket and former investigators asked a federal judge to dismiss the suit.